You might be wrong about RuneScape 3, but not in the way you expect. Having spent the better part of 2 years playing old school RuneScape and more than a year making videos about MMOs, OSRS included, there is only one thing the broader old school community has collectively agreed on. RuneScape 3 sucks. It's the blackest sheep, a disowned sister, and whatever issues are currently facing our game, they must always be contextualized as, well, at least we're not RuneScape 3. I heard about this early on, and eventually I spent some time looking into it. Why is the original RuneScape so hated? But I couldn't let hearsay be hearsay. To come to my own conclusion, I needed to play. And as luck would have it, the recent League's game mode was a perfect opportunity to do just that. I spent a lot of time playing old school's leagues, going so far as to max my entire account. But I spent even more time playing RuneScape 3's league, Catalyst. The reasons, much like the league, were mixed, good and bad. While my general takeaway was very positive, that was despite the mire of dirt and muck I had to wade through first. But this video isn't an analysis of RuneScape 3 on its own, it's a discussion of how red herrings and spite have been counterproductive in improving a game that, in many ways, is a diamond in the rough, and I can confidently say that the gem nuzzled in the depths of shit was some of the coolest and most exciting content I have ever played in an MMO. So let's talk about that. The elephant in the room for RuneScape 3, or one of 3 elephants I'd say, is the monetization model. It wasn't prevalent in leagues, but I am more than aware of it, and if you've seen any of my videos, you'd likely know how I feel. I don't recommend anyone play the main game as a non-Iron Man due to the overabundance of predatory monetization, time devaluing boosters, and glut of cosmetic overrides that already make an aesthetically patchworked game look even less cohesive and recognizable. There have been some positive movements made to alleviate some of these game-destroying elements, but until all of them come to fruition, I will never recommend this game's main mode. If you'd like to play Iron Man, then go ahead, although there are some issues there too. Monetization has been a topic ran dry. I don't have much more to say on the matter beyond that. But I don't think it's the main issue. It's one of these red herrings. People always wax on and on about how if the game were to offer a more palatable monetization model, it'd become more successful. I disagree. It may gain a few players, but by and large, monetization models like this aren't scaring away as many people as one would think. After all, take a look at some of the most popular games in the world right now. Gacha games are as predatory, if not more so, and yet see millions of players chugging away daily. They are defined by gambling, yet people flock to them. No, I think RuneScape 3's issue, sadly, is a lot harder to fix. It's not as easy as removing monetization and watching players dance back into the game world. One of the problems is onboarding. Many lament the state of the game's UI, for example, how it's a muddy blend of hundreds of different, yet all too similar menu options hidden in submenus of submenus of submenus. And while the ability to import someone's UI is great, that doesn't teach the person importing how to navigate it. The problem isn't the UI though, it's the UX, the user experience. The UI itself is actually shockingly customizable, maybe the most customizable UI I have ever seen in an MMO. Yet navigating it is tragic, and its default state is like buying a car and being given 4 wheels and the chassis. This issue of UX extends to just about every facet of the game's onboarding. It took me over an hour on stream to set up the UI, but the amount of time after that I spent searching for options is far greater. I still don't know if the game has a profanity filter option, for example, but what I do know is that it censors the name of one of the endgame bosses for like no apparent reason. This is more likely to put someone off than predatory microtransactions, because MTX doesn't really kick in until later in your playtime. You aren't likely to start gambling until you know what you're gambling for, but spending over an hour fiddling around with this UI is demoralizing. Bad UX infects everything. For example, you can't switch off the combat revolution mode for what feels like hours. Trying to figure out how action bars work is ridiculous. The path system drags you in opposing directions. It all doesn't feel like a curated sandbox. It feels like you're conducting air traffic in the world's most labyrinthine airport. The red herring of motioning to the UI and meaning the UX is one of the many ways the issues of the game become more difficult to understand and eventually fix. The lamenting about microtransactions as the source of issues, the dismissal of the UI, and finally the perception of combat are the three towering horsemen that define the game's negative perception. The latter, combat, being simultaneously the most interesting and vague of the three. Most of the people rampaging on social media about it are lapsed fans, those who played back in 2012 and 2013 when the Evolution of Combat update rolled out and unilaterally destroyed this game's populace. People fled, not just because the update was different, but because it was bad, unbalanced, rushed, and considerably underdesigned. It took more than a decade of constant changes and iterations to make the Evolution of Combat, or EOC, what it is today, and that work is far from over. But because most people's understanding is a decade in the past, they speak of it like one would accurately back then, but inaccurately today. Quite frankly, Jagex really hasn't done a good job of alleviating these issues either. There is this lingering feeling of embarrassment about the game's combat, especially early on. I never played RuneScape back then, so I have no residual spite over it. Similarly, if you are a old-school RuneScape player who still hates RS3 because of an update 13 years ago, honestly, grow up. Let's have some perspective for a moment. The path RuneScape was on prior to EOC was not positive, and it took the failure of it to light a fire under Jagex's ass. It's because of this failure that old-school RuneScape was created and eventually brought forth a new golden age for RuneScape as an IP. Hating it is meaningless and counterproductive. You don't need to play, but you also don't need to feel anything, really. To still harbor spite is to want a timeline where RuneScape likely would have languished in perpetual obscurity and bad decisions. Regardless, my lack of cynicism about EOC made me excited to check it out. I come from World of Warcraft, so action bars and abilities are second nature. I was interested to see how these things translate to RuneScape. That right there is actually another constant red herring that's parroted endlessly about RuneScape 3. It's like World of Warcraft, they say, and I applaud the creative way of admitting that you haven't played either game. Saying this is akin to only watching the Titanic movie for your entire life, and when you eventually watch The Godfather, your first comment is, wow, this is very similar to Titanic. Yes, in the sense that they're both movies that have actors and sets and scripts, but beyond that, they are holistically different. The same applies here. While both WoW and RS3 have action bars, that's where the similarities end. World of Warcraft didn't invent action bars, and having them would place it in the camp of similar to most MMOs that have ever been made. An action bar and the associated combat system is a way of adding depth. It could be that RuneScape 3 was inspired by World of Warcraft's success, but as games, they are not similar whatsoever. RuneScape 3, despite its horrendous onboarding insisting otherwise, is still a curated sandbox more similar to old-school RuneScape than most other MMOs. It's open-ended and classless, meaning you as your character have access to an entire toolkit. Having no holy trinity, that is DPS, healer, and tank, means that the game is operatively different and offers entirely different kinds of challenges. We'll talk about that more later. What's frustrating though is that the perception of RuneScape 3 is so negative that it feels embarrassed about its own combat system. It funnels you down a path of unengagement, trying to pivot your focus to anything other than manually using abilities. This comes in the form of the Revolution mode, which, like anything in the UI, is partly confusing and highly customizable. It allows the game to cycle through abilities in the order they appear on your main action bar. It's convenient for AFKing or doing something low APM, but it's not too conducive with learning the game. If the bar simply cycled through your basic attacks, then I believe it would demand more attention from the player. I was determined to do as much as I could manually, because that is how the game should want you to play, at least eventually. So I did. And damn, around 100 hours into Leagues, I began to feel strange. Like the decades-long campaign against this game's combat system was a lie. Like most lies, it was founded on a kernel of truth, that the initial update was a game-killing disaster, but ultimately didn't represent what I was doing right now, how I was playing right now. The League's game mode has a host of issues that we will get into, but the benefit of one being the relatively low power scale, as in some styles really don't feel overwhelmingly powerful or invincible as they would in old school's Leagues, is that the experience I had as someone who chose the Mage Relic was likely not too far from the base game. So I'm a bit confident in saying that RuneScape 3's combat system, especially in its PVM, is one of the deepest and most rewarding I have ever experienced in an MMO. The rotations here are more complex than anything in World of Warcraft. They have an exceedingly high skill ceiling, and outside of a couple exceptions, there is a surprising amount of intuitiveness to their design. That's not to say the system is perfect. No system is, and there is a burden of clunkiness to overcome as you play, much like when a new player tries Oldschool RuneScape out for the first time and wonders why the game feels so laggy, the tick system. There is a similar kind of barrier in RuneScape 3. The game feels less responsive than even Old School, and that's because you're managing a lot more in this game than you are in Old School. I'm a huge fan of OSRS combat. I love how it's a mixture of high APM skill expression and laid-back relaxation. RuneScape 3 still retains all of that, but the benefit of pivoting to abilities and rotations for its complexity is that most of the initial learning curve is super intuitive. You aren't breaking boss pathing or doing the Wooks Dougie to skip every mechanic known to man. You're just using abilities in a reactive and proactive way. And only by perfecting that do you start seeing improvements in your kill time. One isn't objectively better than the other. My surprise is more so in how different this system was to the way it was discussed by those who don't play, which sounds dumb, but yeah. We'll talk more about the combat system down the line, but as an example of one of the minor yet exciting changes is to the way speed combat tasks are handled. Because the game doesn't have any splashing, you can't miss your attacks, your damage instead scales down based on your weapon's accuracy against the mob you're fighting's defense. There is a surprising amount of consistency to your damage output if you execute your complex rotation well. This makes gunning for speed kills actually fun. Instead of relying on your ZCB spec to land or to not splash multiple times, all you have to do is execute. Now, let's talk about the Leagues itself. It was a bit of a mess. I walked away loving the time I spent, yet feeling mixed. It's indicative of something that the best part of the Leagues was being done with the League itself. The actual grind to Tier 7 had its moments, but became defined by poor balance, lame tasks, and underwhelming relics. While most of the problems are easily excused as a first-time leagues, I think these 3 issues could have been alleviated with better testing. RuneScape 3 is a very time-gated and restrictions-gated game. The former is horrible and should genuinely not exist in any sandbox MMO, in my opinion. The amount of lockouts from the Anachronia hub to the entire Araxi boss fight is inexcusable and mobile gamey, and the amount of quests locking key fun progression remained untouched for far too long. I had to do like 5 times more quests in this leagues than I did in OSRS, and questing in OSRS is very easy thanks to the Quest Helper plugin. This is a lesson learned by Oldschool many leagues ago, and it's frustrating that it wasn't carried forward in RuneScape 3. Now, many of the arguments against this are something like, well, you don't need to do this stuff. That's true. I also don't need to play the game, but a leagues is about expedited progression and power fantasy. There is nothing which limits that more than following wiki quest guides for over a dozen hours. There's nothing less power fantasy than playing the game at a fraction of your potential because arbitrary time gates limit your access. Quests in RuneScape are incredible, the best in the genre, but they are one-off, bespoke adventures. They aren't designed to be repeated over and over again. While quests are worth experiencing, that only applies to the intended format. A limited-time game mode is always fast-paced and fleeting, meaning people are more likely to rush through this content. It's sad knowing that many people's first experience with some RS3 specific quests was being annoyed at having to do them. Sadly, the issues continue from there. Task balance is way off. With all due respect, many of these tasks feel as though they weren't designed by people who play the game, but realistically, it was likely because there wasn't enough time in the pipeline. I don't play this game, and I could immediately see the issues. There is a fundamental lack of balance between points gained for effort required. For example, here's a task to smith a +4 Bane item in Relica. This is an 80-point task requiring at least 80 smithing and the completion of a rather long and annoying quest. Here is another 80-point task that asks you to smith a single bar of a lower tier metal in a city. These kinds of oversights are abundant. So many of the tasks are also just incredibly monotonous. These tiered skilling tasks that ask you to chop 50, 100, 1000 logs are just AFK nonsense, and because of the imbalance in combat relics, which we'll discuss in a moment, you feel funneled into doing them. There is a huge disparity of available, fun, active tasks in the leagues, especially during the middle portion of the Relic grind. This speaks to how much of skilling in RuneScape 3 is a passive off-screen activity and how much that isn't conducive to playing the game. And in a for fun, limited time game mode, you kind of want to play the game as actively as you can. It's fine to have this kind of secondary AFK stuff, but you need to also offer a whole host of active, engaging tasks too. Sadly, too many of these kinds of engaging tasks are either just quests or locked behind quests. The League was not region locked like many of those in OSRS, which means that the entire game world was available. I actually love this choice for RuneScape 3. It made me able to experience a full progression path with my chosen style, but they clearly did not design enough tasks to facilitate it. This league needed around double the amount of tasks on offer. Let people get the dopamine pop-ups from just playing the game. Tier 7 shouldn't feel like a grind. The Dragon Trophy should. Relic imbalance was the final core issue with this league. There simply wasn't enough thought put into some of these relics as compared to others. Thankfully, I went the Excavator and Perfection tiers as those were objectively the best in every conceivable way, and quite frankly, picking other relics of those tiers could very well have ruined someone's league, especially with how much power is locked behind archaeology and invention, and how these relics retroactively do the things their competitors are doing, sometimes even better. The competing relics were so underbaked and poorly implemented that you could have combined them all into a single giant relic and they would still look bad against either of those above. There weren't any wow moments for all but the perfection tier that allowed for infinite money and infinite invention components, which, if you are anything like me, you didn't expect to be so important. It didn't feel like there were any creative options for RuneScape 3 as a game. Many of them felt like backports of OSRS ideas that simply didn't offer enough to compete. Most damning were the combat choices. I am so disappointed with what they did here, and that is even more true now that I understand the game better. None of these options are interesting or creative. 2 of the 4 combat relics were just horrible. Ranged was an AoE-focused buff that barely benefited any PVM, and the magic relic was just undertuned to only equate to a small power increase at the endgame. The necromancy relic was fine, and the melee relic was objectively the most powerful by an enormous margin. Not only was it the most powerful in output, it was also the safest, as it came with a passive lifesteal effect that allowed players to heal through most content. I went mage, and while it was very fun to learn the style, it had me dodge like 15 different quitting points. It didn't feel like I was playing a league, frankly, and that sucked. My choice was so weak that it didn't open up any opportunities to even do PVM until tier 7, which is yet another confounding decision or byproduct of imbalance, considering the one thing most people agree on positively when discussing RS3 is how exceptional the PVM is. The Leagues was a perfect opportunity to showcase that, but because of how long the grind to tier 5 was and how many wrong choices there were, I feel like a lot of players really didn't see the combat whatsoever, not in a positive light anyway. It was only upon unlocking the tier 7 Ascension perk that I get my second wow moment. The multi-godbook procs were super cool visually and had a tangible effect on my output. Now, I would argue that this kind of effect could have been like a tier 3 passive for how minor it really was, but in the scope of RS3 leagues, it felt huge. If I were to adjust anything, it's the way that these individual combat relics were divvied out throughout your progression. I would have preferred to see the shared passive buffs of each individual combat style being given at every incremental tier unlock, and also have them be shared between the styles, meaning that you could still specialize in one specific thing, but also not feel horrible about occasionally doing something as a hybrid. Additionally, each style should have received the lifesteal effect. Regardless, finally, I could learn to PVM. Task imbalance is directly correlated to poor design here. There are too few tasks and too many that are gated by boring AFK content. Meanwhile, the element of the game that should be promoted, the PVM, had seemingly been forgotten completely. I am so shocked by how disconnected the tasks were with what makes RuneScape 3 good. Here's an example. In Oldschool Runescape, the Araxor Slayer boss is a rather easy and chill fight that in the prior league had 1040 points locked behind it. Killing it once, 50 times, 150 times, and 300 times added up to 640 points, and equipping the weapon and the unique amulet were 200-point tasks each. The kill count might seem high, but you have to remember that in OSRS leagues, the kills were so fast that 300 was somewhat palatable. Now, by comparison, here is the Arch Glacior, an enrage boss in RuneScape 3. Not only is it relatively new with intuitive mechanics that teach you the game, it scales up to 4000% difficulty with unique mechanics being added between. It's very cool and fun to do. You'd think they would want to showcase some of these unique features of the game, especially knowing how many new players would be checking this leagues out. OSRS leagues tends to bring back lapsed players. RS3 leagues would likely attract potential new ones too. Imagine if there were tasks for specific enrage brackets to teach new players how to play the game. But no, the Archglacior has 3 tasks: kill him once, kill him 100 times in hard mode, and equip one of the weapons that he drops. This adds up to 480 points. It's just absurd. This is an Enrage boss, the most unique PvM feature of RS3, something that Oldschool Runescape arguably shied away from implementing with their recent Delve boss. This could have been an opportunity to showcase how cool this concept can be. Additionally, it has a killstreak system that has you risk your accumulated loot for better reward. But these tasks not only ignore this, they actively disincentivize it, because they only prioritize kills. The best way of doing them is just to camp the lowest possible enrage, do the most boring thing. To track this all the way back to the beginning of the video, RuneScape 3 feels embarrassed about its combat, even though its combat-driven activities are constantly regarded positively. Instead of ingratiating new players into the system, they do their best to push them away from it. From forcing revolution mode to, in their Power Fantasy League, having like no tasks behind living out that power fantasy. They released another Enrage boss, Zamorak, after the Archglacior, and it's this huge, imposing, difficult group encounter that looks super rewarding to learn. Yet they have no tasks behind it. None. So the only people who would be doing it are the melee relic users grinding for their BIS armor, or ranged relic users who don't exist. It's like if the recent OSRS leagues had forgotten to implement tasks into one of the 3 raids. As someone who used Raging Echoes to learn encounters I hadn't done yet, from the Theater of Blood to the Colosseum, having no incentive to do the same in RS3 was disappointing, especially when so much of my biggest upgrades were locked behind bosses that had no tasks, or very few of them. I'm just grateful I didn't pick Necromancy, despite it being recommended to new players by the broader community, thanks to its lower barrier to entry as the newest combat style. Necromancy is so structurally disconnected from the entire game that it literally has one boss in the endgame that drops all of the good loot. 1. So your progression path would feel very singular and narrow, even if there is some incentive to do a couple bosses as a necromancer outside of that singular loop. All of this is due to most of your power in RS3 coming from your weapons and armor, not your stats or relic powers. In OSRS leagues, much of your largest power spikes were thanks to your combat-specific relic choices, but here it's all gear-dependent. That's not bad, but I wish there were interesting alternatives to explore too. As a side note, I want to emphasize the following. I have criticized Oldschool Runescape's grouping system, or lack thereof, consistently, yet I was utterly baffled by how cataclysmically horrible RuneScape 3's grouping system is. I do not have the words needed to explain how obtuse, convoluted, and broken it is. I cannot stress enough, this needs to be fixed and reworked immediately. Stop everything you're doing and spend a good month developing an intuitive method of pairing players together. This is a PvM-forward game, more so than OSRS, and some of the best bosses are apparently the group fights, yet no one really does them because of all of this bullshit on top of the already existing biases against difficult group content. There are so many players who are likely to enjoy these encounters if adequate grouping systems existed, which they do in other games. Do like you haven't with EOC and take from World of Warcraft their ideas and implement them here. At least OSRS has the player base size needed to populate certain areas. In leagues, I would hop into the Theater of Blood world and see over 200 players huddled together trying to find group mates. Here, nothing. A ghost town. How do you expect anyone to do anything together? Especially when there are like no tasks incentivizing it in the first place. As you can see, my experience was more than a little mixed while grinding out my relics, and I was on the verge of quitting after reaching tier 7. Thankfully, I didn't. When I said the best part of RuneScape 3 Leagues was finishing RuneScape 3 Leagues, I meant it. Catalyst was a lot more top-heavy than I was expecting, and that's in part thanks to how minimal the power increases were. The ironic positive of having poorly designed and under-tuned combat relics for my style of choice is that I needed to actually do the intended progression path. As I hit tier 7 and got my multi-god book, my power increased by around 10 to 15%. That sounds very minor because for 60 hours of work, it is, but I finally felt powerful enough to actually do some of the PVM, especially because drop rates were increased by 6 times with this final relic unlock. Yet another oversight, this made players feel bad for engaging in PVM prior. While some experienced players as well as melee combat users could essentially skip certain difficulties and hone in on the endgame quicker, I did not have that luxury. Slowly and arduously, I taught myself the God Wars Dungeon 2 bosses, from Vindicta to Hellware, and I got over 100 Hellware kills to obtain new weapons. Then I spent around half a day grinding archaeology to unlock ancient invention, then spent half a day making a group to kill the first boss of a raid for an ability codex, which I didn't get, only to realize that the raid is actually time-gated in RuneScape 3. Holy shit, who designed this? And then I began the long journey into the sweltering heat of the fight kiln, and eventually the Inferno. I downed Zuck and obtained a seriously awesome cape. I mean, this thing puts the Inferno cape in OSRS to shame. The content isn't as difficult. The OSRS Inferno is certainly more of a ballbuster, seeing as it takes hours and hours of stacking and unstacking enemies behind pillars for your first kill, but in Impact, unlike in OSRS, you don't receive a borderline cosmetic 1 max hit increase cape, you get a style-specific one that augments an ultimate ability, making it like 3 times as powerful and 3 times as fun to use. With this done, I felt more confident delving into the Araxi boss fight, one which we saw adapted into Oldschool last year. The RS3 version is undoubtedly deeper and more complex, but I'd be lying if I said I enjoyed it. It feels old and janky in the way a lot of older PVM encounters in OSRS do to me as well. After 70-odd kills, I had no luck at the big spider, and considering the time-gated nature of its enrage system and paths, I kind of tilted out of grinding it more. The benefit was receiving quite a lot of supplies for my effort. I decided to replace my tank gear with DPS gear. It's a Leagues after all, so I grinded out a set that boosted my critical strike chance, and afterward I ventured into the Sanctum of Domination, a newer dungeon in RS3 that is conceptually laid out like the Theater of Blood, as a boss gauntlet. I absolutely loved this place. After getting comfortable with the normal mode, I decided to give hard mode a shot, especially considering it drops some of the best weapons available for magic. I spent around 5 hours dying to the final boss, Nakatra, on hard mode. Unlike in OSRS, dying doesn't reset the entire instance. Instead, you can hop back in and try again, which motivated me to keep going and theory crafting my way to success, rather than defaulting to a wiki page or a YouTube guide. Because the punishment for death wasn't erasure of progress, I was more than willing to sacrifice my time and resources for my own enjoyment. Downing Nakatra for the first time on hard mode was the most exciting moment in the league, and I was rewarded for it with some awesome loot. I spent an entire day grinding the Sanctum and eventually picked up both the wand and offhand orb, as well as an upgrade material to make them even better. The upgrades in RuneScape 3 are quite different than in Old School. I have said in prior videos that Old School RuneScape has the best progression system of any MMO, and I stand by that, especially in the early and mid-game when the horizontal systems harmoniously intertwine with the power progression. It's the most exciting and rewarding progression of any MMO. RuneScape 3 is a bit different. The early and mid-game is relatively weak and somewhat boring. It's very vertical in its progression due to most of your traversal being solved by the lodestone network and lack of depleting run energy. I was pretty disappointed at first. It wasn't until the mid to late game did I start to see the vision. The itemization in RuneScape 3 is kind of how I wish itemization was in most MMOs. Every item is distinct, unique, and impactful. There are no boring stat sticks in the endgame, at least that is how I felt. Take a look at this ring I spent half a day grinding for. Lots of half-day grinds in this league. It's an upgraded version of the Berserker's ring that old school players are likely to recognize. While in Old School, the upgraded version, the Ultor ring, takes a solid 35 hours of spanking Vardorvis to obtain and grants you 1 max hit in return, the RS3 version grants you a Kiss Curse critical strike buff that, for Mage, is really noticeable due to the way critical strikes synergize with your adrenaline gain. But that's just one example. Each item that I wore built upon the synergies of my archetype and felt really exciting to obtain. While the endgame in OSRS struggles to find niches thanks to the fear of power creep and the simplistic binaries of the game's stats buckling under the pressure of the mega rare's limiting scope, RuneScape 3 kind of throws caution to the wind and seems to prioritize fun, like actual cool shit that makes your grind worth it. After spending 100 hours at Yama to receive my new best-in-slot slash armor, I felt relief that I didn't have to go back, but the armor itself really didn't open up many new opportunities for me because, at best, it's like a 3% accuracy increase. On the other hand, spending some time to obtain this single pair of poison damage-centric gloves exponentially increased my power and made my endless barrage of hit splats just that bit more satisfying to look at. Simultaneously, not every creature is poisonable, which opens up the opportunity to use these other sets of gloves that give you a different kind of passive effect. It's all really fun to play around with and noticeably changes certain abilities. All of this is to say that I loved the itemization in RuneScape 3's endgame, and it pushed me to continue exploring bosses that otherwise had no tasks to complete. What's better is that the fights themselves are pretty damn intuitive thanks to the more standardized methods of relaying information to the players. What do I mean by this? Well, in Old School RuneScape, there are 2 ways an enemy can deal damage to you: on hit and on animation. On hit is pretty explanatory. If a projectile is about to hit you, then pray the appropriate style and negate the damage. On animation relies on pre-existing fight knowledge and a totally unintuitive gameplay loop, where you're either looking at a tick-based plugin to tell you when to swap prayers, or you're internally counting ticks while barely looking at the screen. The worst part of this delineation within the same game is that it's very difficult to know which is which, meaning that most players are likely to spend hours looking up guides rather than actually playing the content. For example, the Leviathan projectiles are on hit. Meanwhile, the Manticore projectiles, which are almost identical visually, are on animation. These fights were released just about a year apart. This may catch me some flack from the old school crowd, but I hate this. It's stupid, and the only reason it exists is because Jagex developers realize that creating intuitive fights is more important than retaining old traditions, but still default to old traditions to create artificial difficulty or familiarity with certain pieces of content. It's not surprising that this Manticore appears in the Colosseum, a sequel to the Inferno that relies on very similar methods of engagement. Meanwhile, the Leviathan is completely separate and unique, and in my opinion, way more fun. In RuneScape 3, everything is standardized. It's all on hit, meaning that you must determine what to pray by looking at your screen, not closing your eyes and tapping into your 12th chakra to extrapolate the internal metronome for tick-perfect prayer flicks. I found myself looking at my screen more so than my prayers and really enjoying what I was seeing. Raksha is a great example. This big dumb dinosaur is an unbelievably difficult fight that is designed around executing a perfect rotation while reacting to the boss's attack patterns. Match that with an absolutely insane soundtrack composed by Mod Surma, the moderator behind all of my favorite boss themes in both OSRS and RS3 now, and you have one of my favorite encounters in either game. I was on a roll. I began to learn hard mode Karapak, which was yet another S tier encounter, being not only incredibly difficult, but ultra rewarding to piece together too. It dropped my best in slot staff that I was excited to play around with. It was only after obtaining it did I realize that my progression was kind of done. Everything else was locked behind group content, and as I said before, unless you're a popular creator or streamer, finding people to do it with feels like an exercise in futility that I, as a new player of this limited time game mode, wasn't likely to endure. As much as I wanted to explore Virago, Solak, and the most recent boss, Amasket, finding people was just fishing around the clan chat for what felt like hours. With my head hung somewhat low, still riding the highs of obtaining the coolest weapon in the game, I played around a bit with this newfound power and called it quits. My league's journey started slow, escalated to inordinate excitement and addiction, then petered out. Is what I would have said if I wasn't one stubborn motherfucker. I decided to spend a solid 20 hours trying to learn how to solo one of these group bosses, Virago. Failure after failure, eking out the most amount of damage at every possible increment. I finally managed to take him down, a janky group boss from 2013, but a dead janky group boss from 2013. And I did it again and again, until I could craft a set of magic armor truly befitting of my time in leagues. Finally, holding my head high, I could say I experienced most of what RuneScape 3 has to offer in PvM. I played Catalyst for a lot longer than I did Raging Echoes. For as much as the OSRS variant was better polished, more creative, and a far greater power fantasy, the fact of the matter was, by the time you unlocked your 4th or 5th combat power, you could essentially steamroll everything in the game. Most people skipped over progression and quickly obtained their respective mega rare and quit, or grinded points for a bit longer. While RuneScape 3's leagues was not the identity that it likely should develop as an expedited Iron Man game mode, I was kind of happy with what it ended up being. I don't think I would have enjoyed my time with it as much if I wasn't challenged by the content. In fact, I think I would have probably quit a lot sooner. In the next league, I would love to see more emphasis placed on the combat, and if I am to be an armchair game designer for a moment, what I would do is implement the enrage and killstreak system to more bosses. Call it RuneScape League's Raging Echoes, for example, wherein the developers pick half a dozen encounters that are enjoyed, refresh them with an infinitely scaling enrage mode, and grant players a ton of player power. Meaning that those who want the power fantasy can steamroll through existing content, while those who want an actual challenge can infinitely climb the enrage of these refreshed bosses. They could even implement cooler versions of existing weapons with crazier and less balanced effects. And ultimately, there would be a high scores for those who push these fights and themselves to the absolute limits. Give players power, but then give them a place to use it by building off of what is already the most unique feature of RuneScape 3's PvM. Whatever does end up happening, I'll make sure and be there to check it out. So, you're wrong about RuneScape 3, huh? Join the club, because I think I may have been too. In fact, most people are. Even RuneScape 3 players, on occasion, are wrong about their game. That is never more clear than with the mixed reaction toward its most contentious and, in my opinion, cancerous systems. There were a couple RuneScape and Oldschool RuneScape creators that I chatted with in private about my time with leagues, and a couple asked me whether I had any plans to check out the main game. Jokingly, I wanted to respond with the fact that I essentially already had, since my progression journey in leagues was just an expedited version of what it would be in the main game anyway. But seriously, I wasn't sure, and that's for two major reasons. I loved the PVM in RuneScape 3, I endeared myself to the movement, and the clunkiness, much like in OSRS, grew on me with time. There were ideas in its skilling systems that I found really cool. I love the concept of archaeology, uncovering ancient mysteries, unearthing the relics, and harnessing their latent powers. It was all so thematically appropriate to RuneScape. It's a shame then that many of the best and most exciting features are hindered by their opposing faces. As a progression system, as a concept, as an aesthetic, archaeology is more RuneScape than any skill in Oldschool RuneScape. In practice, however, it's just AFKing. That's how you train it. You click a hotspot and walk away for minutes, and this isn't just a leagues thing. This is in the main game too. They created a captivating skill only to make training it the least evocative and interesting thing imaginable. Now, there are exceptions, such as Big Game Hunter. This is the most novel method of training Hunter in either version of the game. I desperately want something like this in Old School, but these methods are few and very far between. The dichotomy of great and terrible persistently drags this diamond back into the shit. PVM is so exciting, so engaging, I am almost inclined to say that I prefer it to Old School RuneScape. But the upkeep necessary to retain that excitement is laughable. Everyone plays an Iron Man in leagues, and even with these expedited rates, the amount of times I had to step away from doing what I'm doing to farm one of the 57 different ingredients needed for a single potion that lasts for 20 minutes, or needed to reset my aura, or didn't have the resets needed for my aura, which made me feel bad about PVMing in the first place. It's just so exhausting. I just wanted to play the game, and yet at every turn, these pesky little chores took me out of doing that, and that's because of how time restricted all of them end up being. Going down the rabbit hole of tasks in Old School RuneScape as an Iron Man is satisfying because it's not breaking you out of a flow state, it's just adding new flow states to glide between. The integration works. Because most of the chores are, as I said, time-gated in RuneScape 3, they become abrupt stops in your progression instead. The irony is that Old School RuneScape players often call RuneScape 3 Easyscape, in part due to the MTX, but also because of its experience rates and ease of training. In some ways, they're right. In others, I'd say RuneScape 3 is far harder than Old School RuneScape, just not always in a good way. By harder, I mean more inconvenient, less quality of life, and not just because of the lack of native plugin support. It's missing key conveniences, such as this wonderful NPC in Narda that mixes unfinished potions and cleans herbs for you. Two things you do manually in RS3 until far later in the game. Thanks to the way MTX has destroyed incremental leveling and pacing, the early to mid-game progression has pretty much been forgotten. It all feels outdated because the majority of the player base is not experiencing it anymore, and it's not attracting new players to give that necessary feedback. While the OSRS mid and early game sees constant updates, the RS3 mid-game is kind of this stagnant oasis of plagued water. Runecraft, for example, is trained in a more outdated fashion than in OSRS. There is no Guardians of the Rift, no Korend Blood Altar, it's the Abyss or ZMI. You can also do the Runespan, but I don't think anyone does the Runespan. All of this is on top of the endless dailies that turn your experience in this curated sandbox MMO to an unbearable relegation to checklists and chores. What's worse is having this conversation within the RS3 space feels borderline impossible. The amount of Stockholm that has overcome those who still play RS3 feels impenetrable to punch through. These are players that have become accustomed to the expedited experience rates fostered by the most predatory possible retention systems. Hourlies, dailies, weeklies, monthlies, FOMO is the name of the game, and for a curated sandbox MMO where a player agency should be at the forefront, having manipulative tactics to kick you out of flow states and demand you go to the upcoming wilderness event because that's objectively the best experience per minute is mind-breaking. For more context, feel free to listen to No Monkey's feedback about this. You can find it in the description below. Just saying "don't do it then" negates the very nature of why these things exist. RuneScape is as much a management game as it is anything else. Managing your inventory, your rotation, your movement, your time is one of the most satisfying parts of playing it. That's what makes the interconnected nature of its skills work. So when all of the most optimal methods of management stem from hourly and daily events, it's not about resisting the FOMO, it's actively grinding against the most satisfying element of the game, because the methods of satisfaction are rendered into buzzsaws that flay away your patience until all that is left is a Stockholm zombie that implicitly accepts that half their day will be spent doing chores that are designed to be done, because that is how you manage RuneScape 3. This stuff, as far as I'm concerned, is more predatory than the microtransactions, because while the MTX affects the mains, this affects everyone. It destroys the Iron Man game mode. Hell, it almost destroyed the league. Infinite shop stocks were only added like days before the leagues began, and I honestly can't imagine playing this game where shops are refilled daily. It sounds miserable. It's hard to be incentivized to touch this game until this kind of teeth-filing, nail-pulling design is ripped out root and stem. So when someone asks me whether I plan to play RS3 after leagues, I can't help but say no. Not until I know I won't be burnt out before I even get to the part I'm genuinely excited for. And the solution to this is not to just skip past the early and mid-game, it's to make them worth playing. I love being efficient. I adore the management elements of RuneScape, but that's only when those elements are driven by my agency as a player and are designed around my choices, not the game's schedule. Being railroaded by a game's schedule is why I quit other MMOs, and a lack of it is a huge reason why I adore OSRS. It's not a question of which dailies to keep and which to remove. It's a fact that they need to remove all of them, or at least each one that is objectively the most efficient. Then we can determine which of those can be integrated back into the game, not as a daily, but as a facet of it. And if the answer is none of them, if the greater community is upset over their lesser experience rates, then there needs to be a broader and more painful conversation of whether this is the kind of game that even wants to grow. There are dailies in OSRS, albeit very, very few, especially by comparison. None of them are really considered optimal methods of achieving anything, rather conveniences if you want. It's not BIS to get buckets of sand from Bert, but it is BIS to do your divination cache twice a day, and for things like birdhouses in OSRS, yeah, they suck. I would gladly have them be removed yesterday, because as far as I'm concerned, people will gladly look past awful monetization if general gameplay is satisfying enough. But the general gameplay feels impenetrable thanks to the antiquated and mobile gamey retention tactics on top of the predatory monetization, on top of the obtuse UX. Well, no wonder people recoil away from this game. I'm speaking not as a game analyst or some kind of pretentious philosopher, but as someone who loves video games and has been playing them for their entire life. Removing microtransactions will not save RuneScape 3. Pushing experience to stars and direct purchases may help rebound the crippled economy, but that has no effect on new players, and new players are the only way an MMO survives. When I say that you are wrong about RuneScape 3, I mean that as a pointed example of how red herring conversations about combat systems, decade-old updates, and general motions to monetization have defined attitudes and plowed over nuances. Latent spite has been at the forefront of the conversation for far too long, and I fear that so much time has already been wasted by the developers pushed into addressing red herrings instead of realistic issues. Monetization and its reduction has been a beacon of hope for the community, a sign of change to come. But monetization is barely even gameplay. As much as I'm glad that things in that space are improving, because as I've said many times, I despise this form of monetization, whether experience is directly buyable or obtained via gambling has no effect on the actual perception of the game itself. It improves the economy, but those looking in still see pay-to-win garbage. To the OSRS players, the evolution of combat was the boogeyman in 2012 and 2013. It is no longer the demon you make it out to be. In fact, it's the best part of the game, in my opinion. It's actually one of the things that could bring people in if they trim some of the bloat and make the introductory experience less convoluted. Perhaps they could add early game challenges to overcome, similar to how Oldschool Runescape created scurrious, perilous moons, and other early game encounters that act as introductions to the combat system. The combat in RuneScape 3 is an example of its uniqueness. A classless, ability-driven sandbox is pretty damn special if executed well. It may have taken them a long time, but damn if it isn't executed well. Based on some of these newest fights, it's executed really well. Let me try be as blunt as I possibly can. I'm begging Oldschool RuneScape players who have no plans to ever engage with RuneScape 3 to just shut the fuck up about RuneScape 3. Please, you have no idea what you're talking about, and you are making this conversation much harder to have when you're still busy having panic attacks at night over Mod Mark introducing a new combat system. Much like how you should watch a movie before criticizing it, you should play a game before doing so as well. That should be the most basic and low bar needed to engage in community discourse. Sadly, in today's climate, when reactionary bullshit devolves conversations into meta-masturbations over review scores, distorted perceptions, and vague politicizing, it's easy to default to the most palatable position, one that feels majority-driven. But that is where art dies. That's when games die. And I hope that those who watch my channel aren't rooting for RuneScape to fail. The problems with RS3 are sadly deeper and more inextricably bonded to the game itself, and if we want a future for our sister game, then it ought be one defined by honest, good faith, and accurate criticisms. I needed to spend around 300 hours playing this game to begin to parse its broader and more specific issues, and I know for a fact that if someone played Oldschool Runescape once in 2013 and in 2025 said something like, "Well, I don't like how you can't move the camera with the middle mouse button," you'd similarly be frustrated and confused as to why they're even taking part in this conversation. More positively, I genuinely recommend checking RuneScape 3 out. There is something worth playing, if only down the line, and familiarizing yourself with legitimate issues is far healthier than parroting misappropriated criticisms. To return back to the question asked of me whether I will continue playing past leagues, I don't think I would as an Iron Man. There is too much upkeep and FOMO that actively destroys the identity of this game as a curated sandbox. But as the issue of multiple faces persists, I can't with excitement pursue the game as a main either. Because while the Iron Man game mode has a traumatizing amount of dailies and weeklies and hourlies pulling your attention and making every moment logged in feel like a race between the next wilderness event, the main game mode sadly has the burden of microtransactions suffocating it as well. I am very much a fan of the long-form commitments and grinds in my MMOs. That's part of what connected me so much to Oldschool Runescape. Having nothing be of value due to the knowledge that just about everything other than PVM achievements can be purchased on a cash shop feels bad. Even if it's just double XP tokens or cosmetic overrides, it's all glut that detracts from achievements I would otherwise be excited to pursue. After all, this is a massively multiplayer game. We exist in the world together. What we wear, what we achieve is a reflection of us, and is recognized as such. When every reflection is perceived as a distorted credit card swipe, then asking players to spend thousands of hours achieving an ideal reflection becomes less and less a reasonable request. And in long-form MMOs, pursuing achievements for their recognized value is what motivates commitment in many players. Finally, as a community, I hope that RuneScape 3 players can sacrifice their short-term dopamine for long-term success. This Leagues was a ton of fun, and I will 100% be playing the next one. I hope that down the line, if the game can drift into more palatable and approachable forms of engagement, I can hop into the main game too. There are so many problems in this otherwise great game, and just about none of them have to do with the combat. It's yet another red herring that overshadows real issues thanks to unresolved anger. It's about time that Oldschool RuneScape players recognize that they are living in the best possible timeline for their game, and as a result, let that anger go. And once that is done, feel more amicable toward the idea of supporting healthy success for their IP, combat, and all. We should all want RuneScape 3 to better establish its place in today's MMO ecosystem, but that will never happen while its biggest faults remain undiscussed and its most impressive successes remain misunderstood. In a rather unexpected fashion, this Leagues bared them open for all to see. There is a game worth saving, a great game buried deep underneath the dirt. So here's a shovel and let's get to work.